Welcome to the Center Square Radio Hour for the second weekend of October 2024. I'm your host, Chris Krug. The Center Square and the Radio Hour are projects of the Franklin News Foundation, a 501c3 independent nonprofit nonpartisan news service. Established in 2019, the Center Square Newswire publishes original, taxpayer-centric street news that focuses on the size, scope, and effectiveness of local, state, and federal government. On the Center Square Radio Hour, our journalists explore their top stories, adding insight to the headlines. We'll also present thoughts on the economy from Dr. Orphe Divounguy, PhD economist, and bring you the latest in K-12 education news from our Franklin News Foundation's Chalkboard News team. Today, we'll look at the final results from the Center Square's Voters' Voice poll. We'll look at the proposed changes for the energy grid in the eastern United States, and we'll discuss the national debt as this year's deficit nears $2 trillion. We'll be right back with all that and more in the Center Square Radio Hour.
Knowledge is power, and you deserve to know what happens in your state government. That's why the Center Square's reporting zeroes in on state authorities publishing stories that show where your money goes and who spends it. The Center Square gives power to the taxpayer by tracking politicians' use of the people's money and demanding transparency from state-run agencies. This is how the Center Square equips you, the American taxpayer, to hold your state government accountable. Sign up now for your state's Center Square newsletter at thecentersquare.com.
Welcome back to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm Chris Krug. With more on the Center Square's final Voters' Voice poll, it's Dan McCaleb.
We are just 3.5 weeks away from the November 5th general election, and this race remains incredibly tight. The latest, the Center Square Voters' Voice poll, just dropped 2 days ago, which shows Vice President Kamala Harris with the narrowest of leads over former President Donald Trump. The poll is among the most comprehensive in the country, surveying more than 2,500 registered voters, and is one of just 6 national tracking polls. Joining me to discuss this and other developments in the presidential race is Casey Harper, Washington, D.C. Bureau Chief for the Center Square. Casey, how do things stand just about 25 days from the election?
Yeah, Dan, you're absolutely right. This race is very, very tight. That's the way to put it. When you look at the polling across these swing states, even just compared to what I was reviewing last week, Dan, the polls have shifted more so in Trump's favor, which is, last week I'm looking at, Arizona, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, of course, 7 or 8 swing states. And Harris was leading, but she's leading by less than a point in most of these states. And now we're seeing that Trump is leading by less than a point in many of these states. Now, of course, our Center Square Voters' Voice poll came out this week and really shed some light on what's going on here. And so there's a few demographic trends that I think we should talk about. But first, just the big picture numbers. Trump and Harris are basically tied. Harris is leading Trump by 2 points nationally, which may seem like a lot, but just keep in mind, Dan, that the Democrats have, won the popular vote multiple times in recent history and still lost the election. And so the popular national vote has to be taken with a grain of salt. Even with Harris winning by 2 points, I've seen some analysis that says she actually needs to win the popular vote by 3 or 4 points, which would be an indicator that she is winning enough in the certain swing states. I also spoke with our pollster from Noble Predictive Insights and gave me some insight into this, but he said that Trump is making inroads with Black Americans and Hispanic Americans, which is really interesting. It's in particularly true and really surprising, I think, that he's making such inroads with Black Americans. Now, in 2020, Trump's inroads with Hispanic Americans was a big story 2016, because Trump was seen, attacked for his immigration policies, called racist for his comments on the border, all of that. But Trump did very well with Hispanics, and he really still does do well with Hispanics compared to past Republicans. Of course, he doesn't do better than Harris, but he does better than other Republicans do. Now, here we are, 2024, and Trump is somehow chipping away at Harris's lead with Black Americans. And we can go into why that is, but it's just fascinating that we have a Black woman candidate who somehow has not been able to recapture the normal amount of Black American support, let alone get up to the Obama era, which is kind of the golden era of Democratic electoral politics.
Now, Casey, so correct me if I'm wrong. Kamala Harris still leads among Black American voters.
Yes.
It's just that the gap that has traditionally been there with Black Americans significantly favoring Democrats over Republicans, that's just narrowing. Is that right?
Yeah, she has, depending on which part of it you look at, she might have 79% or 76% support. But, we saw polls. Biden actually had a lot of Black American support. I mean, I've seen polls where, Democrats mid 80s or 90%. I mean, I think Obama hit 90% support. Now, you might think, well, as long as they get more than half, they're fine. But that's not really how it works, because Democrats have built these coalitions. And that's really, since Obama, has been the strategy, to take every minority group and get an overwhelming majority in it. And then you kind of take those coalitions and ride them into the White House. And it worked for them. But they really need major support among Black Americans to make this work, especially because there are some, large cities in swing states where the Black vote is crucial. Philadelphia, for instance. I mean, Pennsylvania is one of the main swing states where there was a debate there. It could decide the whole election. It was very important in the last election. But Philadelphia has a huge Black vote that could easily swing that state, even if it's slow turnout. And that's the case in many of these swing states. There's a high Black population in a big city that can swing an entire state.
Sticking with the demographics, Casey, you wrote also about the Arab American, the Muslim American vote, and how that's trending a little bit more towards Trump as well.
Yeah, that was really interesting as well because, of course, the October 7 terror attacks were Hamas, which is designated a terrorist group by the State Department. They attacked Israel, killed hundreds and hundreds of civilians, over 1,000, and it kicked off this war that's still going on today and has kind of drawn in Iran and their proxy groups and all that. But it really put President Joe Biden, of course, the former Democratic nominee, in a tough spot because he wanted to back Israel, as he always has and as most Americans do. But there is a significant, segment of the Democratic Party that is very anti-Israel, very, very sympathetic to Palestine at the very least. And many of them are anti-Israel or even anti-Semitic. And so, of course, that's not the majority of the party, but it's a big enough minority to create real problems for Biden, who faced regular protests on this issue. Harris has done better at handling it since she took over. But the polling shows, Dan, that Harris and the Democratic Party as a whole has not regained both Arab American support and Muslim Americans, which, of course, those are separate populations, of course. But both of them are following a similar trend, although Muslim Americans are seemingly, according to the polls I looked at, defecting more to third-party candidates, like Green Party candidate Jill Stein. And that's really important because there's a large, Arab American and Muslim American populations in Minnesota and Michigan in particular, which are two major swing states, right? So Harris has seen defections there, and her taking over for Biden didn't really fix the whole problem. Of course, she still has, similar to the Black vote, she still has majority support, but she does not have as much support as Biden did in 2020, which in those swing states of Minnesota and Michigan in particular could really haunt her.
Casey, in the few seconds we have left, I'm not going to ask you to predict the outcome of the presidential race, but November 5th is election day. Obviously, early voting has started throughout the country. But do you think we'll know the results of this race on evening of Tuesday, November 5th, or is this going to go on for longer?
I don't think we will. No, I don't think we will. The way that it's all set up now, the COVID era allowed a lot of really convoluted voting practices and the popularity of mail-in ballots and all kinds of things that have made our elections more complicated and made it more complicated to count votes. So we'll have a good idea of the trends, but I think at the very least you'll have to wake up Tuesday morning to know for really what's going on, and it could take even longer depending on how close the race is. But of course, Dan, I don't predict it, but last week it was leaning Harris, and I think this week it's leaning Trump. Who knows where it'll be next week? But we only have a few more of these weeks before that lean could make all the difference.
Thank you for joining us today. Listeners can keep up with all things presidential election at thecentersquare.com.
A big thanks to Dan and Casey. You're listening to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm your host, Chris Krug. With more on the new agreement among three of the East Coast energy providers, it's Eliana Kernodle.
3 utilities are coming together for the first time to address energy challenges within the PJM Interconnection footprint. Joining me with more on this story is the Center Square's Morgan Sweeney. Morgan, first, could you set the stage here a bit? What is PJM and what's its relationship with these utility providers?
So PJM is a regional transmission organization, but in other words, it's just the grid operator for 13 states in the Mid-Atlantic and then into the Midwest and South, all bordering each other. And the relationship with the utility providers is that the three that are joining together, they all operate within PJM's region.
And so they're the ones that are providing the energy, but PJM is the one that kind of oversees the grid as a whole?
Yeah, PJM oversees the grid and also engages in transmission planning and development, because as it oversees the grid, it's the one directing kind of how energy gets dispersed, like in the region, and making sure that it gets everywhere that it needs to go. And so these utility providers, they have come together and they've submitted a project proposal from the three of them for regional electric transmission projects. And so then PJM will review the project proposals and then, I assume, pick the best one or the best ones to get the job done.
And what is this new agreement? Who's involved in it?
So it's Dominion Energy Virginia and American Electric Power and First Energy Corporation. And they are just three major utility providers that provide energy in a number of different states. But like I said, most of their states are in the PJM region.
So what prompted this step they're taking to join together to work on a project, something that they've mentioned isn't really something they've done before?
Yeah, so a study was released in May by this group, Americans for a Clean Energy Grid, and it found that PJM needed to engage in proactive scenario-based long-term planning, which sounds like kind of a normal thing for any company to engage in. But I think based on the report, it just sounds like there's so many new factors kind of that have emerged in the energy landscape that I guess there needs to be a bit of a change in how PJM, is preparing for those things, because it's just changing so rapidly. And so they came out with this study, saying, okay, if things aren't like ramped up here a little bit, this grid operator isn't going to be able to meet the energy needs of the region that it covers in upcoming years. And so this joint planning agreement of these three companies, it's a way of kind of like putting their brain power together and, using all of their resources to come up with a plan rather than just, they also did submit individual plans for other transmission projects, but for this one, it's trying to respond to some of these greater challenges that are going on nowadays.
And Virginia is kind of an especially good example of some of the specific problems every state is facing. Can you dig into that a little bit?
Yeah, so I'm sure every state is, a little bit unique in its own way, but Virginia is and has been known for a while as the data center capital of the world. And data centers are huge buildings that store like computer internet infrastructure. And they're crucial to the AI boom. And so Virginia has been kind of courting data centers for a long time because they bring in a lot of taxes. But now, data centers are popping up in more places because everybody wants to be a part of AI and it needs to be, supported. So that's part of the issue is data centers are a huge burden on the grid. They use a lot of energy. And also, the electrification of so many things, transportation, that's really contributing to the escalation of energy needs these days. And then the other thing that contributes too is, or I guess it's just like a factor that complicates this whole thing, is that most states are trying to pursue some sort of renewable schedule. Like they're trying to transition from fossil fuels and older forms of energy to, solar and wind power and things like this. And so they simultaneously have to plan for how to massively increase their electricity output while also retiring these forms of energy that have been relied upon for a long time and installing, all these new ones. So they're not only making up for what they're losing, but they're also, having to compensate for what's going to be needed in the future.
So kind of looking forward, you mentioned that these companies jointly proposed several projects for new transmissions lines. What is the next step? What are they expecting? And what's going to be the cost to ratepayers?
Yeah, so they jointly proposed projects that include a number of high voltage transmission lines in Virginia, Ohio, and West Virginia. And they submitted them through typical project proposal process with PJM. And then if the projects are selected, they'll be selected within the first quarter of the new year. But then after that, they undergo this multi-year process for route selection, and there's environmental and other field studies that are done. And then, they have to get state and local permits. So it's really a very long process before you really see, the fruits of what they've been planning. And then it's too early to determine how it would impact ratepayers because it is really just kind of, in the very beginning stages. But that impact would be determined, like I said, if they're selected over that time that they're going through that multi-year process.
Well, Morgan, thank you for your insights on this story. Listeners can keep up with this story and more at thecentersquare.com.
Thank you, Eliana and Morgan. You've been listening to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm your host, Chris Krug. With more on the ongoing growth of the national debt, we'll return to Dan McCaleb.
With election season dominating the news cycle, voters want to know where the top presidential candidates stand on the issues that matter most to them and how their policies will help improve their lives in this complicated world. Issues such as inflation, the economy and jobs, illegal immigration, with more than 14 million migrants crossing into the U.S. since President Joe Biden and Vice President Kamala Harris took office, abortion rights, healthcare, and more. All are front and center in voters' minds. One issue that really isn't getting much attention or airplay is the ballooning national debt. Joining me to discuss this today is Casey Harper, Washington, D.C. Bureau Chief for the Center Square. Casey, you wrote this week that the annual budget deficit is nearing $2 trillion, almost double the record deficits before the COVID-19 pandemic. Why is this not getting that much attention?
Dan, that is a great question because it's hard to overstate the seriousness of this issue. I mean, part of it is there's some numbness that this has been so bad for so many years and nothing has changed that I'm not sure that you write these stories, they don't get as many clicks as maybe they should, or as you would hope. And so the media starts to ignore it but this is a very serious issue. And of course we cover it at thecentersquare.com because we cover the taxpayer perspective. And so as you said, nearly $2 trillion this last fiscal year. That's a huge number. And just to put it in perspective, Dan, when you look at the deficit, as I know you know, but just as a reminder for everyone, is how much money we borrow in 1 year, which is compared to the debt, which is our overall amount of debt that we have, right? And so the $2 trillion number is so much higher than what we had even 10 or 15 years ago. I mean, just before we came into the pandemic, the deficit had never topped $1 trillion. That was sort of a red line. It was just like a easy, good goal for Congress to not go over 1 trillion. But then the pandemic came and they said, well, it's an emergency. And we'll come back to that because emergency spending. So the emergency came in. Of course, they spent trillions and trillions of dollars. That's one of the reasons we had such rampant inflation recently. They increased the money supply very significantly. They spent trillions of dollars partially because of the pandemic. The deficits went up over 2 trillion. And we said, well, people say, well, it's a pandemic, this happens. But now, Dan, the pandemic is over, well over. And here we are, as maybe anyone with a cynical view of government could have predicted. And we're still near these $2 trillion deficits. It's similar to what happened with the Iraq and Afghanistan war. I mean, we essentially had very, very little debt before those wars, borrowed a ton of money to fight those wars. And even when the wars really dampened down and weren't the main focus and weren't costing as much, we had created this precedent of this runaway spending. And I think the same has happened with deficits in COVID, Dan. So we're in this new era of where a $2 trillion deficit is apparently normal. And as the national debt comes near to $36 trillion.
That's trillion with a T.
Correct.
And I guess I can get, that when you think about that amount of debt, it's hard to grasp, I guess. But if this was your personal finances and you've maxed out multiple credit cards and you've got a mortgage and you've got 2 car payments and inflation is where it's been the past 3.5 years, that's going to consume you individually. Working on your own personal debt, it's going to be a huge issue for a family, right? The U.S. is beyond maxing out its credit cards.
Oh, yeah.
But nobody's talking about it. The Center Square's Brett Rowland wrote this week about former President Donald Trump, the Republican candidate, and Vice President Kamala Harris, the Democratic candidate for president, how both of their fiscal plans have gone through analysis, and they're both going to add trillions of dollars to the national debt, but nobody's holding them accountable for that.
Yeah, both candidates' plans, as you said, will add to the debt. And you talked about the individual level of this. If you took the national debt and you divide it up, per American, it's over $100,000 per person in debt. This is not like, this big debt, but it's the whole country. I mean, if you split it up, it's more debt than any American has except for their mortgage for most Americans, right? And then to keep with your household budget analogy, just a reminder, Dan, that the interest payments on the national debt are, if you just look at the projections in the next decade, the 2030s, the interest payments on the national debt are set to be by far the largest expense. So to extend your metaphor, imagine how bad your financial situation would be if your largest household expense was not medical bills, was not mortgage, was not car payments. It was interest payments on your credit cards and on your mortgage. I mean, that is a level of bankruptcy that, most Americans aren't even allowed to get to because the credit card companies wouldn't let you probably, borrow that much. So it's kind of crazy. But to mention that poll you brought up, the Center Square's Voters Voice poll, inflation ranks as the number one most important issue for Americans. Now, of course, part of that is because prices have risen more than 20% since, President Joe Biden and Vice President Kamala Harris took office. And so it is top of mind. Now, the economic issues are usually top of mind for voters, but 47%, that's, in second place is illegal immigration. The economy is at 32%. For all the talk about abortion, and Democrats are talking about a lot because of the overturn of Roe v. Wade, only 26% of Americans rank it as their top issue. And then way down here, national debt and government spending is only at 14%. And so it's funny that inflation gets so much attention, whereas government spending doesn't when they're so related.
Well, plenty more to talk about here, Casey, but we are out of time. Thank you for joining us. Listeners can keep up with this story and more at thecentersquare.com.
Thanks to Dan and Casey for that update. That'll do it for the first half of the Center Square Radio Hour. After the break, we'll look at more top stories from across the nation. What case are some California parents making against their school district for requiring their 5th grade students to teach gender ideology to kindergartners? How did the vice presidential debate highlight the major parties' differences on school safety? And what should we expect from the housing market as we look ahead to 2025? All that and more when we return on the Center Square Radio Hour. Welcome back to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm Chris Krug. Here are this week's quick hits, some of the original reporting that you may have missed at thecentersquare.com. Hospitals and healthcare facilities across the U.S. performed more than 13,000 gender reassignment procedures on minors between 2019 and 2023, according to the nonprofit group Do No Harm, which opposes such procedures for children. The youngest recorded patient was 7 years old. These procedures include the use of puberty blockers, hormone treatments, and surgeries such as mastectomies and penile reconstruction. The group reports 4,160 breast removal surgeries and 660 phalloplasty procedures were performed on minors during that period. An Afghan citizen released into the U.S. less than 10 days after the deadly withdrawal of U.S. troops from Afghanistan was arrested this week for plotting an Election Day terrorist attack on American soil. The U.S. Department of Justice on Tuesday announced charges were brought against the 27-year-old Afghan national residing in Oklahoma City, for conspiring to conduct an Election Day terrorist attack on behalf of the terrorist organization ISIS. His co-conspirator, a juvenile, was also charged. On the anniversary of Hamas's October 7, 2023 attack on Israel, Senate Republicans united to condemn Iran-backed Hamas and express support for Israel's survival. Led by Senator Rick Scott of Florida and Senator Joni Ernst of Iowa, the Senate Republican Conference introduced a resolution condemning Hamas's actions, including its use of rape as a weapon of war. They called for the safe release of American hostages and voiced opposition to violent anti-Semitic protests. Jury selection began Wednesday in the bribery and racketeering trial of former Illinois House Speaker Michael Madigan. The 82-year-old who served in the Illinois House from 1971 to 2021 and was Speaker for nearly 4 decades, faces 23 counts of bribery, racketeering, and official misconduct. Madigan also chaired the Democratic Party of Illinois from 1998 to 2021. Potential jurors reported to court and filled out questionnaires on Tuesday. You can find more on these stories and others like them from across the country at thecentersquare.com. We'll be right back with more on the Center Square Radio Hour.
Teacher Lauren Johnson returned all the graded essays but one. He believed that one student was capable of more.
I don't believe taking the middle of the road is your philosophy. This time, write something you really believe.
The student wrote a new one about excellence. Instead of just grading an essay, Mr. Johnson changed a life. I am that student. I became a writer, and I wrote this to thank him.
Thank a teacher and pass it on from passiton.com.
Welcome back to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm Chris Krug. With more on the lawsuit against a California school district over a program that required 5th graders to teach gender ideology to kindergartners, we'll go to David Mastio.
Today we're talking about some unusual events in which 5th graders taught kindergartners about what color their shadow was. Joining me today is Kenneth Schrupp, California reporter for the Center Square, who's going to explain exactly what happened. Kenneth, tell me about this.
Hi, David. A California school district allegedly had a 5th grade teacher teach a lesson on and read a gender identity book to 5th graders, then had those 5th graders watch a video of said book with their kindergarten mentees who they see each week and are paired to one-on-one for the whole year, and then had those 5th graders teach the gender identity lesson to their kindergarten mentees.
What did parents have to say about this?
Parents are outraged. They're now suing the school district and demanding that a notification and opt-out policy for all objectionable content be extended past just this health unit exclusion that the school district has allowed.
So do I have this correct? There is an exclusion policy in place, but it didn't count for this instant because it wasn't in a health class?
That's right, David. Encinitas School District allows parents to opt out of and review the health unit, which includes lessons on puberty, health reproduction, media influences on body habits and body image, hygiene, boundaries, bullying, and diseases and their transmission, including information about HIV/AIDS. Parents wanted to opt out of this unit on just instruction on gender identity and transgenderism as an affront to their religious beliefs. But the parents were told they couldn't opt out of just the gender section, but had to opt their children out of the entire unit on health, which they did. However, this did not really cover the school's buddy program that pairs these 5th grade students with younger students that they learn and work with every single week for one class period. And these are paired with the same kid for the whole year. So they develop a lot of trust and friendship with each other.
And it also seems to be like a way to use peer pressure. You know, these younger kindergartners look up to the 5th graders as the big kids in school. And so the teacher is using that relationship to get younger kids to adopt something that they might not otherwise. Is that right?
That is what the lawsuit alleges. Before I go into what the book was and the lesson was, let's just see what one staff member said to another at the school about this book and this activity. Here's the quote. "We might just inspire some sweet things to fly toward their shadow tomorrow," end quote, which suggests the lesson had a desired outcome. Now, let me talk a little bit more about the book. The book is called My Shadow is Pink. It's a picture book for young children in which a boy wonders about his gender and how he believes it differentiates from his father's gender. The boy says he loves wearing dresses and dancing around. The boy wears a dress to school, making the father anxious and stressed. But after a hard day, the dad decides to wear a dress to pick up his son, and he tells his son, "Pick up that dress, your shadow is pink. I see now it's true. It's not just a shadow, it's your innermost you." So this was the book that the 5th grade teacher read to the class. After the students in 5th grade had this book read to them, again, the students in the lawsuit say this is unusual because the 5th grade teacher had rarely read books to the students because it's a 5th grade class. After this, the 5th graders were sat next to their kindergarten mentees and shown a read-along video version of the book, with one plaintiff, and he was in 5th grade, saying he wanted to cover his buddy's eyes and ears to protect him. Next, the 5th graders were told to have their buddies choose a color representing their buddy's gender, and then the 5th graders were to draw their buddies' outlines in chalk with the selected color that communicates their gender. And the 5th graders felt that the message that was supposed to be conveyed was that gender is determined by an internal feeling. And these 5th grade students were very bothered about this and told their parents about it.
So what's the wider context in California? Is this a common kind of occurrence across the state, or do other school districts teach in the same way about transgender issues?
There are a lot of lessons that schools have adopted to reflect this. In the last decade, California adopted an inclusive curriculum requirement that has seen a lot of these things added to state curriculum standards. California also leads the nation in the number of sex reassignment procedures and surgeries performed on children. Over 2,000 children in California have submitted insurance claims for either gender hormones or gender surgery. In Los Angeles, which has the 2nd largest school district in the nation, there's a partnership between LAUSD and Children's Hospital Los Angeles, which has performed the 2nd most number of gender medical interventions on children. The Center for Trans Youth Health and Development at CHLA has a partnership with LAUSD to direct them to its services. CHLA's trans clinic has treated students as young as 3 years old, at least according to PBS.
Kenneth, thanks for joining us today. Listeners can keep up with this story and more at thecentersquare.com.
Thank you, David and Kenneth. You're listening to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm your host, Chris Krug. With more on the different approaches to school safety in the vice presidential debate, let's now go back to Eliana Cardodal.
During last week's debate between candidates for vice president, the two sparred over school shootings, illustrating the ideological divide between the main political parties. Joining me to discuss this is Chalkboard News editor Brendan Clary. Brendan, what did J.D. Vance and Tim Walz have to say about school safety?
Yeah, essentially they took very different approaches on the best way to ensure the schools are safe. And specifically, Senator J.D. Vance from Ohio, the Republican candidate, he was asked whether he would support charging parents of students who are accused of school shootings with involuntary manslaughter, like what happened in Oxford. And he said that it would depend on the case and that he would trust law enforcement to take the right approach there. And, he said that we need to do better, right? So again, kind of this understanding tone. And I just, before we get too far into it, I want to say I was really encouraged actually by the dialogue between the candidates. It was very refreshing to hear people respectfully disagree about stuff, and something that I think kind of no matter what your thoughts on politics are, it was actually a very good conversation. And there was some heat, some tension, but like never like an inappropriate amount, and never really in a way that was, hard to watch. Like I think some political debates are. So I just wanted to say that was a really fun and kind of encouraging thing to see. And there was some overlap, right, on the fact that something is wrong and something needs to be fixed. But then they kind of ended there, unfortunately, right? That the way that these, parties think about this is completely different.
Yeah, could you get into kind of the specifics of the points that they argued?
Yeah, absolutely. So essentially, Vance said that we need to protect kids. And so he said that, I don't like to say it this way, but basically we need to beef up school security. And that we have to, he said we need to make the doors lock better. We have to make things stronger. We've got to make the windows, bulletproof. And we have to have more school resource officers. Because he said, the idea that you can, quote, magically wave a wand and take guns out of the hands of bad guys does not fit with recent experience. So he said, we've got to make our schools safer, and we've got to have some common sense bipartisan solutions for how to do that. And then Minnesota Governor Tim Walz, he basically said that, a school shooting is terrible, and that, we've seen too many of them. He said, I'm a hunter. He said, Vice President Kamala Harris is a hunter. I haven't seen that reported anywhere else, so that might be a gaffe. Interesting if true kind of thing, right? But he said that the Second Amendment is there, which is true. And that, he said that there's a way to cut down and curtail on gun violence without taking away guns. And I think that in Minnesota, he said that they have red flag laws, background checks, and then you can start to kind of figure things out there. So I think in a nutshell, you have the Republican candidate, J.D. Vance, saying we need to beef up security because you can't just get guns out of the hands of bad guys. And then from Tim Walz, you have him saying we need to put in these reforms or these checks to make sure that we don't have bad guys with guns, right? We don't have the wrong kinds of guns, right? So you can still do maybe have your hunting rifle, but there's no semi-automatic rifles. And again, without a lot of the specifics there, I think Vance definitely had more of those specific measures of here's what we do, the steps that we take. And so with Walz, it was really we can have guns, but then also try to keep people from using these other kinds of guns, or keep them away from people who would maybe do harm with them.
And there was a really interesting moment that kind of highlighted the different focuses even further, and that was their exchange about Finland. What happened there?
Yeah, so Walz said to the moderator that there are things we can do, again, with not infringing on your Second Amendment rights. He said that Finland is a great example. Walz said that he'd spent time in Finland and that there's a high gun ownership rate there, but they don't experience the same high rate of school shootings that we do in the United States. And so he said that, here are the things that we have to do to try to make our schools safer instead of making them look like a fort. We can take these protections. But then Vance replied in response to that. He said that, the Finland is a great example. Again, he was agreeing with Walz again. It was kind of a healthy dialogue, but he said that if you look at the rates of depression and anxiety and substance abuse, that in the U.S. they're much higher, right? So when Vance looks at it, he's saying the underlying problem needs to be addressed, and he said that we have quite a mental health crisis in this country, and that we need to get to the root causes of it. So he said, I don't think that's the whole reason we have a bad gun violence problem, but he thinks it's a part of it. So you have, from these different points of view, these different political parties, again, these are the leaders of these political parties, kind of these thought leaders or, representatives of the political parties in America looking at this issue. And on one hand saying there's reforms that they have in Finland that we can enact here. And then the other is well, look at all these other problems that we have in America that they don't have in Finland. Couldn't that be part of the problem as well? And so I think that's, the tension between these is, in one, you can just legislate this and make some fixes from the government's perspective. And the other one, it's more we have these societal, deeper issues that are the problem, and we need to try to fix those somehow. And I don't know how you would necessarily do that with policy on either side, to really try to straddle the balance between Second Amendment rights and, personal freedoms and, those kinds of things. Those are very difficult challenges on either side.
Yeah, definitely an interesting conversation, but like any debate, there's only so much detail you can get into and only so much detail they want to get into. But thank you for your insights on this story, Brendan. Listeners can keep up with this story and more at chalkboardnews.com.
Thanks to Eliana and Brendan for that update. You're listening to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm your host, Chris Krug. Joining me to take an early look ahead to the 2025 housing market, it's PhD economist Dr. Orphe Divounguy.
So let's just couch this like right off the bat. You know, there's a fairly significant event scheduled for November 5th, where the United States is going to select a new president. The Democrat Kamala Harris, she has some ideas. Republican Donald Trump, he has some ideas. And depending on who comes out on top, I mean, we'll have some say in the future, the near future of the housing market. But the reality of it is right now, one thing that I think all Americans can agree upon, and it sounds like Congress is finally, like the political class has finally caught on to this, to the reality that we're short on housing in this country.
Oh, thank God. Thank God that people are focusing on housing affordability finally, right? We're talking about housing affordability. People realize there's a massive housing shortage across the country. I've written extensively on the topic. I've estimated we're short roughly 4.5 million homes.
Every time I talk to you, that number gets bigger.
Yeah, because you know what? Think about it. In 2023, we built roughly 1.6 million homes, and that's just nothing compared to where the deficit was.
Yeah.
And at the same time, we've had population growth, right? People coming into this country, we have an increase in the number of families coming into the United States. And so our builders need to be able to keep up. And the only way builders will keep up is if we deregulate a little bit more, right? Especially at the local level, get rid of these little barriers to building, like minimum parking requirements, trying to decide the heights of buildings, etc. Let the experts be the experts, and builders know what they're doing. So, but anyway, you're right. We have this election coming up. But here's what I have to say. What are the determinants of housing demand? Incomes adjusted for inflation and also mortgage rates, right? So in the for sale market, those are the things that really, really impact whether people are going to move and whether we're going to see an increase in home sales in 2025. Historically, elections have very little impact, right? So it's a little blip. People stop a little bit before the election. Then when they realize everything's fine, they go back out in droves and continue with their life decisions, right? And so that's usually how elections affect the housing market. Now, in terms of policy, first of all, I'm going to say it again because I think it's important. I'm so pleased to see that both political parties are talking about housing affordability again. That's great, right? It's so important to the well-being of the U.S. economy because housing happens to be the biggest expense on families' budgets, monthly budgets. The biggest expense, it's 42% of core CPI, right? So it's so important to the U.S. economy. And in terms of policy, sadly, both parties, and this is the headwind, right? There's lots of tailwinds. Look, affordability has improved a lot in the past year. Mortgage rates have fallen roughly 1.5 percentage points when compared to a year ago. So the 30-year fixed mortgage rate is down. The typical mortgage payments is also down 3% lower than it was last year. Zillow forecasts that home sales could increase roughly 5 to 6% next year, right? Home values could actually take up a little bit as a result. There could be some demand coming back. Supply could also be coming back. Look, new home sales are already up 10% when compared to a year ago. So you have a lot of positive activity, positive momentum, despite the affordability challenges that people are still facing. Now, the headwind to housing is the fact that fiscal deficits are continuing to rise and are expected to continue to increase. And if we don't get our house in order in Washington, D.C., that pressure could turn out to be inflationary and could push rates, at least keep them higher for longer. And that's the problem, right?
Yeah, I think it's interesting. And so let me ask you this. I mean, we all, of course, it's DC's an easy target. It's a big target. And, I mean, there's a lot of sentiment that DC very rarely gets it right. How about at the state level? You and I have talked about like the places where people are moving and the opportunities, the building that's occurring, a lot of it being in the Southeast now. Texas continues to grow. And by Southeast, I'm being generous. I'm including the Mid-South, like Tennessee as well. And then certainly there are some places out West where growth continues, housing growth in Arizona continues to full steam ahead roll. But what are the implications of state level policy as it pertains to, what could or what could not happen in the year to come?
Well, look, the states are very different one from the other, right? They also have their local issues. At the federal level, it's usually, you dangle a carrot and say, hey, I'm going to help. We're going to fund project XYZ if you do this other thing here. That's kind of how the federal government influences state and local policy. And so it really is going to depend. I mean, in California, for example, you continue to see higher and higher tax burdens, right? Income taxes continue to increase. They increase the tax rate. They say it's temporary and then it sticks, right? They never roll it back. So you have differences across the country like that are going to influence the outcome. Always think in terms of supply and demand. Disposable incomes adjusted for inflation. Why do I add disposable? Because tax rates vary across states.
Oh, wow.
Exactly. And so whatever you're going to keep in your pocket is going to make a huge difference. And so disposable income adjusted for inflation, but also builder activity. Some states are more highly regulated and prevent builders from building. For example, I just gave a presentation where I showed housing permitting activity in the Seattle metro where I live. It's been downward trending for years. And permits are roughly 35% below where they were before the pandemic.
Right.
In the Seattle metro, single family permits. That's terrible, right? Something's we got to fix that, right? And I know they're trying to fix it. There's some activity at the state level and local levels to try to fix it.
But is that like NIMBYism, like not in my backyard? Or is there something more to it? I mean, because the type of housing that you're talking about in the Seattle metro area would be higher density housing simply because that market is just so, is it fair to say it's overheated? I mean, it's expensive.
Well, it's expensive. Most of the city of Seattle is zoned for single family units only.
Right.
And I think that's a problem. Builders, in order to respond to affordability challenges, builders have been building smaller.
Yes.
Been building attached units, attached single family units as opposed to detached.
Yes.
They've been building taller, but if you have limits on the types of units you can build, it's going to make it very difficult for builders to build in the area and respond to the challenges. Mm-hmm. And so I got to say though, I think things are moving in the right direction. Even in California, that's known for being super restrictive. You're starting to see a movement state level, at least to allow for more construction. So that's the good news, but they're still so far from where we need to be. If you want to see where we need to be, you look at Texas. Texas is building like crazy. You look at places like Raleigh, North Carolina, where permits are still 11% higher than they were before the pandemic.
Right.
I appreciate your thoughts as always, Dr. Rowe. That'll do it for another week of the Center Square Radio Hour. The Center Square Radio Hour is a production of America's Talking Network, produced by Eliana Curdodal. If you missed some of today's show, you can find it at americastalking.com. I'm Chris Krug on behalf of everyone at Franklin News Foundation. Thank you for listening to the Center Square Radio Hour.